Everybody. As Ariana said, I was a design ethicist at Google. What does that mean? So what that means is if you zoom out and you see this 2 billion person ant colony called humanity, and every single day that 2 billion person ant colony jacks in by, as Ariana said, the first moment you wake up, you check your phone, right? And now what you're doing is that phone is like this sort of remote mind control device that starts steering all these 2 billion ants in totally new directions. So when I was at Google, I was studying how do you ethically steer and manipulate the human mind, which is really a conversation about how minds work. So when I was a kid, I was actually a magician. And it taught me to see the mind not as this authoritative thing that we all make our own independent choices, but to focus instead on where our minds are vulnerable. And magicians know that attention spans work a certain way. If you emphasize certain choices, people might pick that one first. Short-term memory is a certain way. There's all these limits to the mind. And the funny thing about magic is that it works on all minds. It doesn't matter what language you speak. It doesn't matter whether you have a PhD. In fact, actually, people with PhDs are usually easier to manipulate. So it's a fascinating discipline because it says something about how all minds work. And none of us get to choose that. It's sort of like telling a chimpanzee to choose whether they're attracted to a banana, right? Or what they say about virtual reality. When you plug on the virtual reality thing, you can consciously know that there's no ledge right there. And they say, take a step. But you have millions of years of evolution that are telling you this, do not take a step off that thing that's fooling your mind. So now, flash forward, we're here at Google, and basically it's 2013, and I was a software engineer there. Excuse me, a product manager there. I used to be a software engineer in my earlier life. And I made a presentation basically saying we have a moral responsibility as Google for shaping 2 billion people's attention. A moral responsibility. Now, why? Because I actually want to claim to you we have a serious existential threat that's coming from the everyday personal technology in everybody's devices, and that's not an alarmist thing to say. I'm going to tell you why that's true. I want to tell you why we can predict the future. We often say, technology could go in all these different directions. We can make all sorts of different things. Who could know? We can make a 747. We can go to Mars. But I want to tell you why technology, the ones that are in our pockets, are going in a very specific direction. And that is because there's this invisible goal that's guiding all the design decisions that the designers and engineers make. And that invisible goal is the race for attention, right? There's only so much attention in the world. There's only so many hours in a day. And every company's business model, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, right, Snapchat, they're competing for this one thing called our attention. And there's only so much. So let's say you're YouTube and you've got that 30 minutes right now. Even if you're not trying to maximize and grow that 30 minutes to something bigger, just to hold on to that 30 minutes, as more attention shows up for competing for it, you have to reach deeper down the brainstem and create an unconscious habit, a hook. It's not enough that you use the product, I have to addict you to it. And so how do we do that? Well, in the tech industry, we use these techniques that I actually learned at a lab called the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab, that basically teaches young engineering minds how to recognize persuasion in products and then how to use those principles to keep people engaged or hooked. So the simple example with YouTube is you autoplay a video. So you're watching one video and you autoplay the next one. By just autoplaying it, you can increase how much time people spend. But once you do that successfully and you're keeping people's time, then Snapchat looks at that and says, well, you're going to shrink how much time people are spending in Snapchat. So I'm going to add this streaks feature. Streaks, if you didn't know, how many people here have kids who use streaks? OK, a good number. If you didn't know, Snapchat, this is really important. Streaks are a very persuasive feature. What they do is they show next to each person in your contacts, if you're a teenager, the number of days in a row that you've spent with that you've sent a message to each person in your contacts. So if you're a kid, it's just like tying two kids on treadmills, two different treadmills, tying their legs together with a string and then hitting start at the same time. So they have to keep running and keeping up all of these streaks, right? And this is a manipulative technique that you can learn from a playbook that I learned along with many friends of mine who were at the Stanford Persuasive Technology Lab. And the point is that these techniques are going to get thrown into more and more products over time. they're not going to not be thrown in because the business model is how do we get more of people's attention? So we know where technology is going. It's going to get more persuasive, not less. And it's basically causing all of these externalities across the public spectrum. So one is a public health problem because you have more and more kids who are addicted and feeling lonely because the better I am at keeping you on the screen, the worse you are going to be at basically making choices that involve getting out with friends, right? We're putting this new choice on life's menu in your pocket that is always going to be faster, sweeter than reality as it is when it's boring. And then every single time you open the screen, there's 1,000 engineers behind it who are trying to keep you hooked for as long as possible. So we have a loneliness and mental health problem. It's never been easier as a kid, as a teenager, to wake up and see photo after photo after photo of evidence of my friends having fun without me, right? There's a temptation with this conversation to say that we've always been worried about kids and media and technology, and it'll be fine because it always is. We gossiped on the phone in the 1970s, right? Like, we turned out fine. I played video games as a kid, so I turned out fine. So why should we be worried now? What's new right now is that we've never had, especially for teenagers, if you just think about in all of human history, when have 100 million human animals at the age of 12 to 19 years old been subjected to evidence of photo after photo after photo of their friends having fun without them, right? We've just never had that before. We've never had streaks where you have these puppet masters of technology companies knowing how to tap you on the shoulder, and say, hey, you should tag this friend in that photo. And then so you tag them, and this person gets an email saying your friend tagged you in a photo, and meanwhile, it's all been orchestrated by the puppet master, which is Facebook, right? So we have 1,000 engineers on the other side of the screen manipulating billions of people every day. There's 2 billion people jacked into 2 billion people jacked into Facebook. That's about the number of notional followers of Christianity, okay? You have 1.5 billion people jacked into YouTube, which is about the number of notional followers of Islam. And these products have more influence culturally over the daily thoughts, experiences, feelings, and social obligations and development of all of these human beings, which is why, back to the very beginning of this conversation, we need to understand and have a more compassionate view of human nature if we're going to be designing, and we have this inevitable influence on 2 billion people's thoughts. So how do you do that? Well, it starts with having a magician's view or an evolutionary biology view of people's minds, just like Francis, who was just up here talking about the teenage brain. If we know something about how the prefrontal cortex develops, right, and we know that there's a developmental period where you don't want to overexcite that sort of impulse dopamine loop at that age, not just should we have parents who know about all this stuff and not give phones to their kids, but how do we make the default settings work for everybody? So how could Apple, for example, knowing this, say, hey, how would we design phones so that they buzz at a certain frequency or rate that's less than that threshold which causes us to have all those phantom buzzing in our pockets, right? There's a frequency amount in which if you stimulate very frequently, we suddenly all reach for our phones all the time. And Apple could help design the phones differently to respect that evolutionary boundary, right? So another example would be Netflix, which currently Netflix says our biggest competitor in the world is sleep. So they're in the attention economy, you're competing for all other forms of attention. And so their stated goal is to basically eat into sleep. And so that's exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about. So instead, if we said, hey, look, there's this evolutionary boundary or limit to the human mind and body called sleep, which we need about 8 hours, and how would we have technology that's on your team to help you make that choice to fall asleep in that way, as opposed to being completely adversarial to it? One other thing I want to add into this is one new thing that's never been true before is that we have AI plugged at this thing. What that means is you often see or hear this talked about as addiction, right? We open up our product, these are phones, and you see people addicted to their phones. And that word really hides a lot of nuance and complexity about what's going on today. Because when you land at that YouTube video to see that one video that your friend shared with you, what you don't realize is that on the other side of the screen, you just activated a supercomputer that's playing chess against the chessboard of your mind and can see 50 million steps ahead on the chessboard about what will be the perfect next video I can show you to keep you on the screen, right? And so we know what happens when Garry Kasparov and human beings with limited minds play chess against really big supercomputers. We lose. And so what we're calling addiction is basically AIs pointed at our brains that are going to beat our brains more and more often and rehearse the kinds of schedules that we don't want. So the only way to solve this is to change how we make all the technology that's in our pockets, to put pressure on the technology companies, and to redesign the products in a more humane and respectful way. So I hope we can do that together. Thank you.